Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. Although not today. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we are going to let our guests introduce themselves to our listeners and viewers at home, starting with Miss Charli Cox.
As JR said, I am Charli Cox. I write sci-fi and military fantasy, and I am thrilled to be here.
Oh, freaking standing. Next, we have the outlaw author himself, Mr. James Fain.
Hey everybody, I am James Fain, as JR likes to say, the outlaw author. I write mil sci-fi, urban fantasy, military urban fantasy, whatever you want to call it. That's the relevant stuff for today. Anything with a sword fight, a fist fight, or a gunfight, I am there, because that's what I like to do in real life, and that's what I like to do in fiction.
Outstanding. Next, we have Mr. Nathan Petty.
I am your resident Canuck, all the way up here in Canada. For cold far north, I write military sci-fi crime thrillers, fantasy, and sword and sorcery.
Welcome to the show, eh?
Yeah, but he's Canadian, so in Canadian military sci-fi, they actually apologize every time they shoot him. Hey, sorry, eh? And then they shoot him. I mean,
they throw grenades in soup cans.
I mean, soup cans can be useful. I lived on soup for the year I was deployed. You could stick the soups in the engine block of the Humvee and it'd heat itself. And then when you get to wherever your stop point is, just pop the hood, grab your soup, you're good to go. I mean, ignore the gas flavor. That was just for grins and giggles.
That just
that was extra flavor.
Right? All right, Robert, if you could introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers at home. And I should specify that while his name is Robert, he publishes as R. Max Tillsley. So
I publishes everything. I have aliases. So Robert Tillsley, Max Tillsley. I write science fiction and fantasy for adults and kids. I am a HEMA longsword instructor, and I also get on my armor and beat up people for fun and no profit at medieval fairs.
And you sweat under that armor?
I have all the sweat. After all, I'm in Australia.
That's probably at least in the colder places you could, it's not as bad.
I did suggest running around naked and hitting each other with swords, but for some reason people just weren't keen on that.
My wife would read that.
She read that book. One of the military advisors I have to get some of my Canadian stuff or my Australian stuff right. This past summer, the Brits were talking about it was so hot, and it's like a third of the temperatures you guys get. And he was complaining to me, laughing that the Brits don't know what hot is.
Yeah, when I lived over in the UK, it'd be what I would consider a mild day, around 24, 25 degrees Celsius. And at schools, they'd break out ice blocks, so like frozen water-flavored stuff, because it was hot. And the kids needed something to cool themselves down.
Yeah, it's called sweat. Your body does that.
Please, the English don't sweat. They perspire.
They perspire. With their pinkies out, of course, because they're proper. All right. The next part of the introduction, dear listeners, how we found them. So we were actually met in the Shire while we were avoiding the press gangs. Luckily, we weren't recruited. We survived the war because we weren't drafted. A moment of silence for those that didn't make it. But we did, and we're here. So, what are you going to do? All right. So the religion question, is everybody ready for this one tonight? We're going to do a little different this time. All right, I say we're going to do a little different this time. Like, I don't mix it up every time, but it just makes me feel special to say it that way. All right, so the religion question, 300, Jason and the Argonauts or Gladiator? Nathan?
300 all the way.
Okay. Charli?
I concur, 300, absolutely.
Okay. Robert?
I'm going to have to disagree. I'm going to go Jason and the Argonauts. And the reason why is because it reminds me of back when I was in school and we made these little stop motion movies.
Oh, go on. Stop motion movies when in school. I don't remember that. So tell us, please.
So you had these little figures made out of plasticine or clay or whatever, and you just move them a tiny bit and take a photo and move them a tiny bit more, and that's do it enough times and you get frames of a movie. And if you look at the beautiful, absolutely amazing visual effects of Jason and the Argonauts, that's what you're seeing. It is terrible.
Okay. So you were actually doing that. Okay. All right. What about you, Jesse?
What we do in life echoes in eternity. Absolutely Gladiator. You guys have heard me talk about the Midnight Sea several times. The should be coming out at the end of this year, maybe the beginning of next year. And one of my very main characters, the Emperor Hadrian, is actually based off of Prospero from Gladiator. That's where I take the inspiration from for a lot of his character. Love the movie, one of my favorites of all time.
Okay. What about you, Nick?
It's a toss-up between 300 and Gladiators, so I choose both. Super secret option D.
Okay. I'm Gladiator for me. It's got some of the most quotable lines. Like, I like that what we do in life echoes in eternity. I dig it. Plus, it's kind of cool opening scene. Just ignore it. It's not historical. If you can pretend that it's just fantasy and it didn't actually, attempt to portray itself as realistic, you're good to go.
They're messing up my people, in Germania.
Yeah. All right. Because we are polytheistic. Troy, the Centurion, or Alexander. Nathan.
I guess it would help if I'm unmuted, right?
It does sometimes.
I would go with Troy. It has the nostalgia factor to it. I remember watching it, growing up. It was the one that I loved.
Okay.
It was all the Brad Pitt character, especially the beach scene.
Okay. We don't judge. Charlie?
I'm glad you don't judge because I haven't seen any of them.
What?
What?
Sorry.
What?
All right. So you're going to take D, none of the above. All right, Robert.
I'm going to go in there and say I have also not seen any of them. And instead, I'm going to throw in the high-quality movies around fantasy and fighting. Arthur, the Fighting Eagle. And if anyone's seen that they will appreciate the quality of my movie tastes.
I have not.
What is the name of this movie? I'm going to write this down.
ATOR, the Fighting Eagle.
Okay, we might have to.
Don't blame me. Don't blame me if you watch it.
I'm going to have to check that out. It sounds interesting. All right, what about you, Jesse?
Definitely going with Troy. I enjoyed all of them. Alexander was good, even though it had some really strange parts. But just with Gladiator, like you said, the quotability, the ending of Troy always gets me a little emotional. When Odysseus is saying, "If you remember anything about me, remember that I lived in the time of Hector and the time of Achilles," and just stuff like that. So again, the quotability. The fights are cool, even if they're kind of funky and the physics don't really work. And I really love that movie.
All right, what about you, Nick?
I got to go with Troy. One of the best beach landings I've seen on film at that time. It was pretty cool, and it had some great lines in there. When the little boy comes up and he's like, "Achilles, they want you. He's a big man. He wants to fight you." He's like, "I wouldn't want to fight him." He's like, "That's why no one will remember your name."
That's why no one will remember your name.
Total brutal and savage, but I mean, he's right. If you don't put yourself out there and face the giant or face the dragon or face the giant obstacle, no one will remember your name. And that's what was important to Achilles, even in the myths. He wanted his name to last forever.
That's one of the cool things is people, when the movie came out, they were like, "Oh, the armor wouldn't allow them to move like this. Is pure Hollywood." So the historians in Greece, the historians
was awesome.
No, they actually had historians in Greece recruited. I wanted to say it was 1,000. It could have only been 100, but it was definitely a significant number of Marines in the Greek military. They had them train like they would have back then for a month. and then they had them basically go through like fight type choreograph, just to see how long they could last. And if you're physically fit, that armor was not restrictive. They were able to do everything in that movie and more than they showed with the armor. Now, obviously, that period armor isn't going to give you as much as, you know, what Robert wears as far as protection, but it wasn't as cumbersome as everyone makes it seem to be, which surprised me.
There's a really weird sort of concept that's gone around for so long that armor is like you've just put that same weight into a box and you're carrying that box around, and it's just not like that. You know, when you've got armor on and it's well fitting, that weight is spread across your body, and it just does not affect you in the same way.
That makes sense.
Well, Jay, the other part, look at our body armor in Iraq. You know, we were wearing about 75 pounds worth of kit, you know, but it was equally distributed amongst our bodies. So you really didn't feel the weight because it wasn't like you were carrying it in your arms. It was on my head. It was on my chest, you know, supported by my hips and my back. You know, so
absolutely.
That makes total sense.
Yeah, and they've done there's a famous video. I think, Robert, you were even the one that sent it to me. That's got a firefighter in full firefighter kit, a SWAT officer in the full that, and then what's supposed to be a grunt. But my only discrepancy is because they tried to match the weight. Is the grunt's running with his rucksack on, and everyone else is running with just their firefighter gear or their police gear, whatever. He's the only one that's got the pack, so the weight's the same, but his is balanced. And quite frankly, if we're running an obstacle course because we're moving to contact, you drop your packs. So I don't think it was entirely fair. But what surprised me is what the guy in the armor was able to do. And there's some videos floating around where people are like lifting heavy weights, like at a gym in armor, climbing trees, just to kind of show you can do it. I mean, obviously they try to get to that point, but it's surprising.
Oh, yeah. One of our guys in my group, he is in the Australian Army, and when we're out there fighting in our kit, he likes to wear a lot of chainmail for his thing, which is, you know, wonderfully heavy, and he does jump kicks in it. So it's nice. It's quite possible to do an awful lot in armor.
Well, the one of the funny videos out there with the guy lifting in full plate, just to show, they've screen capped that, and that's where a lot of the "Dost thou even lift, bro?" memes come from.
Hoist. Dost thou even hoist?
Yeah, that's what it was. So for me, I'm a sucker for the Romans. So Centurion, I've seen that movie way too many times. I liked Troy. I liked Alexander. Those are more time commitments because they're so long as movies.
Was Centurion one with Channing Tatum?
No. Centurion is the one. It was the British film, came out in 2010. It had Neil Marshall was the one that wrote it. It didn't have any names that I recognize as far as
Ben Kingsley.
Yeah, no, it has Michael Fassbender is a British actor as the lead. But yeah, it's a good film. I really enjoy it. I've seen it several times. I know my friends that are a lot more historically accurate than me in their knowledge of like Roman stuff. Like, we'll nitpick it, but I can just accept it. You know, get sucked into the world and believe it. Because that's the one thing everyone thinks of the Roman armor as like what they were at their height, but depending on the era, like their armor would vary greatly. And the later in the empire, sometimes you would see armor from across the generations because it wouldn't be uncommon to pass it down to your kid if it held up. Weapons and kit were hereditary. So for me, it's definitely Centurion. Speaking of my love of the Romans, The Last Legion, The Lost Legion, or Pathfinder, all of them are excellent movies, so you can't go wrong. Nathan.
None of the above.
What?
I didn't. No, the one that I would throw in there is the Eagle.
Okay.
For the whole scene of the Testodos.
Yeah. I get it. Okay. I'm down. What about you, Charlie?
Once again, I have to go with D. None of the above. I feel very ill-prepared tonight. I didn't know there was going to be a quiz.
Well, we're going to send you home with homework of all these movies you need to watch.
Okay, fair.
So what about you, Robert?
All All right, I was trying to think because it's been a long time since I've seen any of these, and I realized I think it's the Last Legion is the one that has Ben Kingsley as Merlin and Colin Firth, who is normally like romantic comedy, bumbling British dude. So I'm going to go with that one out of memory, and if I am going to randomly go with dodgy Roman things, then I'm going to throw in all of the Doctor Who bits with Roman soldiers because they're wonderfully trash, and I love that.
What about Monty Python's Biggest Dickus is a funny one take on the Romans.
History of the World Part 1.
Yep.
Has a
that's a good one too.
Segment. That is absolutely classic.
Have you seen any of those, Charlie? Are we getting in the range of ones you might have seen?
Yes, I have seen the Monty Python movies. I'm not
There you go.
that inept.
All right. What about you?
Mel Brooks.
Yeah. What about you, Jesse?
Big Carl Urban fan, so Pathfinder.
Excellent movie. Vikings can't go wrong. Vikings versus Indians.
Yeah, well, and I put both together from the Dragons in Combat. Rune's both. He's a combination of those two.
Nice. All right, what about you, Nick?
I'm gonna go Pathfinder because I haven't seen the previous things on the list.
So Lost Legion and Last Legion are both available free on Amazon Prime if you have a membership. Just throwing that out. Throwing that out there. We're gonna have to do some more movie reviews just for the fun of it. It's my excuse to actually take the time to watch them. It's for work, honest.
We'll make content.
Yeah, I love Pathfinder. The Vikings are always cool. You can't go wrong with Vikings. And since I picked a Roman one for the last one, I feel like I'm okay picking Pathfinder. But I like the way they did that with the sort of sprinkled in the god role and whether they're helping or not. It was subtle, so it's not in your face. So you could argue that it's just historical fiction, or you could argue that it's fantasy. You could justify it either way. But famously, the ice scene was good, where they had them kill themselves on the ice. So
yeah, it was pretty cool.
So, all righty. And finally, if you're going to get sucked into one of these fantasy worlds, because, we're talking about fantasy armies, what weapon would you want to take with you, Nathan?
A nice long Zweihander. Because it's iconic, it's big.
Okay. So size matters for you. Okay, we can go with that.
A little bit. Compensating, maybe.
Throw the name of that sword in the show in the chat side chat so I can copy for the show notes. What about you, Charlie? What weapon are you taking? Are you going to fight with in a fantasy world?
Well, in a fantasy world, as long as there's firearms, I'll be good. So probably my SIG, my nice EDC. I'm comfortable with it. I can hit the target every time. Monsters are going down.
What happens when you run out of bullets?
That's what reloading's for.
Okay, but you're in a fantasy world. You can't necessarily reload indefinitely. Do you have plans to switch once you run out of bullets?
Then I guess I would have to go to my knife.
Okay. Throwing knife or thrusting, stabbing? I mean, they're two different styles.
Thrusty, stabby.
Okay. All right, Robert.
This is hard. My head says a spear because it's depressing how effective a spear is against pretty much everything else, all things being equal. But assuming not a spear, if I want to go, I'll go with a longsword because it's a two-handed weapon, but it is a weapon of finesse. There's a lot of ability to defend as well as attack. It's something you can transport without getting too much in the way. So I would take my trusty longsword.
Yeah, I saw a video. One of the I'm drawing a blank on it. Lindy Beige, I think his name is the channel. He did a video where he basically got a bunch of people that did HEMA, and he's in England, and so they're going to defend against a group of essentially high school kids, whatever they call that. He said it was something form. I don't know what all that means, but high school kids in England, and he gave them sticks and taught them like 1 hour lesson on how to use a spear, and they were able to hold their own against these guys that have been training in HEMA for years, just because it's so effective.
Yeah,
because the reach is pretty forgiving. on a proper spear. So I get it. It is kind of depressing to think about because swords are so cool. Right? But thrusty stick wins every time, I guess. So, all right. What about you, Jesse?
I'm very tempted to say spear as well, but if I'm not cheating and saying magic or a gun, which of course are my first answers, if I could really get to pick in a fantasy setting, I'm going to be the necromancer. That's going to be me. All that being said, a shield. I'll figure out. If I got to sharpen a stick with it, that's fine. But I'm a big dude. I'm 6 foot. I'm always around 300 pounds, and I'm a retired powerlifting champion. So most guys that don't understand what weight training is, I'm going to bowl over. And I'm gonna get tired fast because I'm heavy and out of shape. So I'm gonna use my shield. I'm gonna knock somebody out, and I'm gonna get out of there.
Just tell me it's a kite shield and not a buckler.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Heater all the way. Yeah, heater all the way.
That's what most people don't realize is how offensively you could use the shield as well. The Romans were adept at that, turning the shield into a weapon. Especially if your shield is long enough, slamming it down on their feet. Your feet don't work, you can't stand to fight. And if you're laying on the ground turtled, you're a pretty easy target. So, all right, Nick, what are you picking?
Fantasy setting, huh? What weapon I use? Does Star Wars count as a fantasy setting?
Sure, you can pick your lightsaber.
No, I'm not going with it because you called me on my bluff. I'm going to go with the glaive from
All right, so if we're going actual medieval weapons, I like the flails and the maces. They're just kind of cool. But I don't know. If I like sharp stabby objects that fly is even better. So an addle. Going old school. They still work though. They're effective at range. Quicker to reload than a bow and arrow. You don't need to worry about fletching, so you can just grab a sharp shiny stick and make a bunch of them. I mean, it's a pretty forgiving weapon. They hunted mammoth with them.
Has anyone ever modernized that to see if with modern materials, reliable heads, how that works out?
I do know that we found, so everyone talks global warming, global cooling. They've gone back and forth in that in our lifetime if you're of a certain age. What I will say is at least they suspect the poles are shifting. And so as that happens, some formerly exposed tundra is now no longer covered in ice. So that's where they found the saber-toothed tiger and the woolly mammoth baby that they were talking. We could use that to clone them and bring them back. Lots of great memes out about that. Like, that's probably not a good idea to bring extinct animals back. But as part of that, they actually found some addles, and they used that to make modern ones. Now, they did use wood. They were really easy to learn. Again, they took a bunch of out-of-shape history professors, and they were able to reasonably hit a target. Now, obviously, if you're hitting an animal, the targets, from the period, the targets are rather big because they had it like mammoth and saber-tooth shaped. And they were obviously stationary, but I don't know. You could probably make them out of something other than wood, to like a plastic or whatever, that would make them last longer. I don't know if it changes the physics of it. I haven't seen anyone try.
Yeah, I'm just curious if you bump it up to a solid, 1,000-grain arrow with a nice big broad head on the front of it, and then huck it, if it still flies decent.
I don't know. I know there's a channel on YouTube, and he might be on Rumble and all the other places that does, like, he builds historic weapons forged in something, I think is what it's called. Not forged in fire, because that was the History Channel show, but it's forged in something, and he builds a lot of speculative weapons from like sci-fi or from fantasy, like, and to see what's possible. So I don't know that he's done that. I'm gonna have to Google it when the show's over because I'd be interested. But yeah, addle, you can't go wrong with that.
The Australian equivalent of that, it's called a woomer spear thrower, and that's I'm pretty sure that they could get some quite decent ranges and use them for hunting, and they didn't have giant mammoths to have big targets. So I think they're pretty decent.
Can you write in the chat how to spell that, so we'll throw that in with the show notes?
Not a problem. Just bear in mind it's also named after a town as well, so you'll need to be specific when you're looking it up.
Okay, that's good to know. So, all right, with that out of the way,
range.
yeah. At the moment, we're going to pause for a moment while we shamelessly show for the man. So once we get started on the discussion, I know it's a little early for a commercial, but once we get started on this discussion, we don't want to get sidetracked. But oh, by the way, let's chill. So we're going to do that now.
Are you searching for an epic new fantasy book to read? Well, look no further. Try out Spring for Spears, where the fate of the Wolf Riders falls on an outcast. Astrid would give anything to be one of the Ulfsark, the fearless warriors who ride giant Amarak wolves. Like her ancestors, she yearns for the soul-deep bond with the wolf, the connection, the union, a chance to prove her worth and honor her mother's legacy. Yet, she's never heard the wolf song, and with each passing year, it's likely she never will. Except Astrid refuses to accept her fate. Then, an encounter with a nature spirit and a foreign princess dashes her last hope and changes everything. Will Astrid save a fragile peace and embrace her destiny? Or will her dreams of the wolf song fade to distant lands? Join Astrid and friends on a thrilling new fantasy adventure in A Spring for Spears, the first novel in the Wolf Song Saga, a series by best-selling, award-winning authors Katie Cross and Derek Allen Sidaway.
All right, thank you for sticking through that commercial interlude. I know normally part of the religion question, we talk about coffee, tea, and all the good things. We'll save that for the end because I really did want to dig into this. So first, obviously, if you're talking paranormal fantasy, you've got all the modern tropes, all the modern weapons. So it's kind of understood what you need there because weapons are weapons. It's not anything special. So for this, we're going to kind of focus on the medieval-esque themed fantasy worlds for the creation. With that said, what are the considerations you think if you're going to write a believable fantasy unit in these, quasi-military or medieval worlds? What things should you consider when planning?
Who are you fighting, and what are they armored with? Because I've seen it all over the time. You have these guys in their plate armor, and the guys are using swords. And it's like, well, that's not going to cut through that metal. How are you going to open that tin can? It's not with a sword.
Crow's beak.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Nathan. Like there needs to be a cohesiveness to the way that things, the way that people are armed, the way that they fight. Because if you're as you say, if you're going with plate mail, you're going to want something that either has the proper crushing power or the ability to puncture. If you're going against cavalry and you've got your army with little arming swords, it's not going to make any sense. There has to be some level of logic, unless of course that's how you choose to have that army entirely crushed, and you go, yes, they had the wrong kit.
You actually hit on the first consideration that no one ever talks about is, have they fought this other enemy before? Have they engaged with them before, either in peace or war? Because most people don't realize that it's a yin-yang arms race of defense and offense. So if we fought them before, if they have A, I counter it with B. When I counter it with B, they change A to C, and we go back and forth. And so if they've experienced each other before, their kit's going to be complementary in a way where, their offense and defense offset each other, at least to some level. And if there is a discrepancy there, that side, generally wins. If there's not, that's where tactics and desire and drive come in. So if they've never experienced this culture, then if there's an offset on the weapons, it makes sense. But then you got to weigh in, like you talked about, if they're wearing heavy plate and all you've got are, wooden spears, you might be in trouble. Versus, if you've got rapiers that can thrust through instead of slashing, you're stabbing, you might be okay. And so that's the first consideration, is have these two cultures interacted before if you're going to build a military that faces each other, because that affects, what they would have on both ends.
You can look at history for just that. I mean, look at the Mongol Empire and how fast they expanded across into Europe, and they got to Europe. And because nobody's experienced them before and nobody knew how to counter them, they thought they were running away. Spoiler, they weren't running away. They're luring you into a trap.
Well, that was just a hit and run tactic. It was essentially a guerrilla warfare tactic against an army used to conventional warfare.
They destroyed Russian armies using that tactic.
I'm not saying they didn't, but the difference is they were fighting asymmetrical warfare against armies trained for standard combat.
Exactly.
And guerrilla warfare often is at an advantage.
Yeah, but you did touch on something which I think a lot of you guys would be able to talk about, and that is the way that they were trained. And so when we're considering these sorts of things, obviously at an individual level, if you're doing urban fantasy or things like that, you can just have someone who's skilled up through trainers and things like that. But when you're looking at a medieval-esque army, and obviously varying time period in that, is it a professional army? Is it an army that's actually gone through training? All those sorts of things will also then follow on, not only to tactics, but what are suitable weapons and arms, what armor they're going to wear, and all the rest of it. Because you can't just slap people into a whole bunch of armor and give them a spear, whatever, and go, let's win. Or you can, because it turns out terribly, but it's certainly a viable thing. But it's a very different sort of thing from a professional permanent army.
Yes. The other part of that if you're going to have a professional army, is the size is not going to be what we're used to, because logistics matter, and they couldn't preserve food in the same way. So it'd be more difficult to field such a large force.
If I was going to give somebody like a cheat code, like, hey, here's the one thing you can go look at that will help you with this, it would be the 30 Years' War. You have combined arms. You have a still semi-medieval support system. There's a whole lot of raiding, pillaging that feeds those armies. Finding whatever you can find, taking whatever you can take, which was a classic theme of feeding an army throughout antiquity because of supply issues. So if I had to tell somebody like, hey, just one piece of history you can go and look at that would help you with this, that would be it. You also get to see how all the different weapons react.
So it's interesting, because that's my group. We cover the 100 Years' War, and part of that is because of the sheer level of transition of arms and armor allows us to be somewhat flexible with our period accuracy. But yeah, all of that transition across, and certainly my understanding across the 100 Years' War compared to the 30 Years' War, during the 100 Years' War, we're still at very low level management of structure. Like if you're used to privates and sergeants and all the rest, they just generally did not have that fine-grained control within the militaries as well.
So, Charlie, you were going to say something?
Earlier, going back to armor, if we're talking about a fantasy setting, then we can't negate the possibility of magic. And what if that armor is enchanted somehow? So what kind of weapons and what kind of tactics are our characters going to use to defeat that enchanted armor? That's something else to keep in mind.
Yeah, this is more for you, for the audience. So one of the things we get, especially because Nick and I, we make no bones that we were military, and a lot of our guests, because we have friends with the military, were at some level, and people think, well, I don't have a right to have an opinion on X, Y, and Z topic because I didn't serve. So, or you don't think you can understand tactics for the same reason. So I can tell you, if you've ever sat down and watched a hockey game, a soccer game, a football game, whatever, you can understand tactics, because there's not a sport known to man except for golf that didn't originate at some level as a training ground for young warriors. And so the tactics that you use for movement as a team in those games is the same kind of things you're going to be thinking about in combat, just with deadlier odds. You're not going to have someone flopping around for a red card. They're going to be flopping around because their leg got cut off. But I mean, otherwise the ideas behind that kind of movement is the same. And so if you can understand sports, if you kind of get your mind to understand that applies to combat, it'll make it make a lot more sense for you. So there we go, Nick. We made it make sense for Stabby.
Stabby.
So that's the other thing you spoke about magic, Charlie, is that also would be offensively. Did they enchant the blades for the +1 flame swords or whatever you want to do? Because that's going to affect what you need for armor too. Because if you've got a lava sword, your armor ain't going to do but so much.
Right, exactly. And in my setting that I'm writing in right now, we have elves with enchanted armor, and so that armor will deflect most firearms. But if you get that armor hot, say with, muzzle blasts from a Mosin Nagant, you can break through that armor and then your bullet's going to hit where you want it to. But it's just a matter of what are your rules in the universe that you're writing in, and how are you going to make it believable to your reader.
And if you've got dwarves and elves, a lot of times they have different metals that they use with different properties. So you'll end up with the elves that iconically have very pretty, super lightweight armor that allows them to move like they're not wearing armor. And that's a difference too, because, even if you've only got a little bit of armor, it still affects the way you move. Versus if you're running in your tracksuit, right? So if you've got armor that replicates the effect of wearing nothing, you can do a lot different things than if you're wearing, full plate, for instance. And it's a trade-off, speed versus offense and defense. And, most of the time units or militaries would have a mix of all of the above.
If I can play off of Charlie's thoughts, I'm writing a short story where they're trying to take out a dragon, and their armor is actually leather and wool. Essentially to cope with the fire. So it provides a level of protection. It wouldn't have the same level as steel, but what it does do is provide a level of insulation and fire resistance. So even without magic per se, you can still modify the arms and armor to cope with a magical being.
Yeah. And there are various waxes and stuff people would coat stuff in back in the day to prevent fire. Because, before there were fire brigades, villages, your thatched roof catches on fire, you're screwed. So they actually had things, natural oils that they would coat things in that would make things, flame resistant, not flame proof. And that exists in the natural world. I can't for the life of me remember what it was they were coating stuff with. But, that kind of stuff exists in the natural world. So you've got to imagine there might be something even more powerful in a fantasy world that would offer some level of protection against that as well. So now there's also the consideration of how they transport. Are they, foot soldiers? They're walking in the shoe leather express, or are they riding mounts? And if they're riding mounts, are they standard horses as we know them now, or is something magical, a unicorn, a Pegasus, I don't know, rhinoceros? I've seen that in some fantasy, and that matters too. If you want to see the difference it can make, watch how the elephants, were affected when Hannibal crossed the Alps and what he could do to the British lines until they panicked and attacked his own units. But that kind of thing matters too, because there's some of that shock and awe factor if you've got this massive beast, which matters, I think.
Dragons. That's pretty imposing to see this giant flying reptile coming at you with a mouthful of fire. How do you fight that? That's something else to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think that's definitely where the modern studies, like if you study modern military or at least something that has something like artillery, what is a dragon if not an airplane or a tank? If you have this big huge mammoth, they function very similar as a unit. In a military setting, and the doctrine or mindset that a military would apply to them is very similar as an airstrike or a tank or whatever, when you've got your Oliphants or your dragons or whatever. So I feel like that's important, is that you understand maybe how those tactics work, because that's how you can use your fantasy elements as well. Fireball and a trebuchet are the same thing.
Dragons doing strafing.
And the other side, again, sort of those of you with more military experience would have on this, though, is the logistics element that we're talking about before. If we want to make it realistic, well, how much does that dragon have to eat? If you have an army of dragons, how far can they fly in the day? Do they have to actually return somewhere safe for the night? All these powerful creatures, we can use realism to give them limitations to not only make them defeatable, but to make them interesting.
Yeah, that's that quote by John Pershing is soldiers win battles, but logistics win wars. There's some truth to that. Or Napoleon's famous an army marches on its belly. I mean, that is a huge thing, and that is often ignored in fantasy worlds. Like, where are they feeding these animals? Now you can get away with it if you've got like clerics that can magically make food once a day, right? Like divine mana or whatever. If you've got, the bag of endless food kind of thing, you can magic a solution to that. But you definitely at least have to consider like every living creature in your military, be it dragon, horse, whatever. Like that's a mouth you've got to feed. I don't know if not horses, but I imagine at some level you've got to shod the horses like with this horseshoes. I don't know if they did that back in the day or what. Like I said, I'm not a horse person. I've ridden it at the zoo once, if that counts. When I was 6. But the care of the animals, the animal husbandry is a factor too that is often ignored. So someone's got to muck the stalls, so to speak. Now you would know more than me. Are you familiar, Robert, with the concept of the tooth to tail ratio?
The amount of damage versus
how
far.
The tail ratio is how you can figure for every one fighting soldier in the field, you need X soldiers in the rear to support them. So it used to be during World War II to Vietnam, it was generally 1 to 12. Now it's like 1 to 10. Although some of that's cheating because we use contractors and we don't count those in the numbers anymore. But that I imagine if you're talking about a medieval army, that number gets significantly higher because you've got the camp followers to wash the laundries because you don't have washing machines, and the cooks and the doctors and animal handlers and the people that do the food. I imagine that's a huge factor too, like the wagon train that follows the army, so to speak.
Yeah, and very dependent on the makeup of the army. If you wanted to have a smaller force that was mostly nobility, then each person's going to have an enormous retinue to support what they're doing. If it's a mercenary army, then again they're still going to have a retinue, but it's going to probably be a bit tighter. They've got all the people that are more for the group as a whole as opposed to the individuals. And if you're going to have a peasant army, well, you better have a lot of them because they're going to die of disease along the way, and a lot of them are going to starve as well. So you really got to consider your numbers. And like the peasants, I suppose, wouldn't have needed as many support people, but they in themselves become a logistical nightmare.
Yeah. So. And then the other part of that you got to factor in that we haven't really addressed, although I found that the quote I was looking for originally was "The amateurs talk tactics and professionals study logistics." Omar Bradley on Omaha Beach. That was the one I was looking for. But the other part is like how you fight and how you outfit your military in these settings. The terrain and the weather matter as well. Like, are you in a flat terrain that is going to make cavalry really good? Are you in a heavily wooded Black Forest kind of terrain? You're going to severely limit the ability of your mobile forces to do their thing unless they're lighting fires and burning the woods down around them. But if you do that, you potentially, if you destroy the land, you can't feed off of it later. So that's the other part is, are you on a war of conquest or are you just a war of destruction? Because your end goal matters too to how you wage that campaign. Because if you poison the well that you want to drink out of later, that's a problem. So the objective of the military would be something we would have to consider as well. So Nathan, you've been a little bit quiet.
Well, one of the big issues that a lot of places kind of ignore, a lot of the fantasy books kind of ignore is they do ignore the logistics, but they also ignore manpower. So you walk through these fantasy world and you see these villages, but there's nobody around. Yet you have an army of tens of thousands. And it doesn't make any sense because where are all these people coming from? You only show 2 villages. Each village is 100 people. How do you get 1,000 soldiers or 10,000 soldiers?
You saw that problem in Stargate as well, and part of it is just a budgeting thing for action. As far as if you're talking visual medium,
but this is books. I can write 1 million soldiers across the field with, it's a book, right? how hard is it to do that? I don't have to animate anything. I don't have to find a million extras. And so a lot of the fantasy books, they don't show that industry. Everybody's walking around in plate armor. Well, where's the forges? Who's making that armor? You have this fantasy magical armor that repels arrows. Well, who's making it? Who's supporting all this industry that supports these armies? And it's ignored. I understand why.
It's not sexy.
It's not sexy. It's who cares about the forges? Show a forge. Have somebody talking about getting a new sword. It's those little things that makes the books all so much better. Because you have them go in there, hey, my sword is all dented. I need it all fixed. Oh, this is a magical sword. I can't do that type of magic. You need to talk to Bob. Bob does that type of magic.
Nathan, you're throwing up so many things that have me thinking in there, because like one of the things, swords, like people, constantly fantasy movies, this sword was passed down from my great grandfather. Well, then it wasn't used. It wasn't used, because I can tell you that I've had two swords snap on me in fights I've been, and these are designed to flex way better than a medieval sword would have. They break. We've got swords where we fight where you file off the rough edges and things like that, but you hit a point where it's like, no, that sword's gonna break. And so if you've got the money, well, you replace it before it breaks. That's a huge thing. And smithing is a skill. Like you look at a lot of sword making, the blades were quite frequently made in a few areas, and then they were shipped without any of the handles or quillins, and they were actually then made up later to suit local needs. So you've got a whole industry that can occur across your medieval continent, because even though there were lots of battles and things between, there's an awful lot of trade as well.
And so that's one of the things that it had me thinking. So first off, if you want to see how kind of the factor, like what you need to consider in swords, I think it was Forged in Fire was the one on the History Channel where they would make the blades, and then you'd have the guy, this will kill, and he'd like cut like various carcasses with the blade. And just to see Forged in Fire, you see some of the amateurs who mess it up. So the minute it's cutting through a carcass that simulates a human, the blade shatters and warps. So, I mean, you make it wrong, you don't even get the first swing out. And if you're in the middle of a sword fight without a sword, you're kind of in trouble. And so that did matter. And if you made a bunch of crap that got a bunch of people killed, assuming they didn't kill you, you're going to be hard pressed to find more work. But with that, I've seen in some fantasy novels, one of the quest is you've got these parts of this sword, you go find a smith to remake a sword out of it. Is that actually possible, Rob? Can you take the broken swords and reforge it?
So essentially you'd have to be doing forge welding. So you heat it up enough and you essentially layer one bit over another, and from whatever directions you're hammering it enough, you might need to use a little bit of powder to take away some of the oxidation. This is stressing my blacksmithing knowledge and certainly beyond my skills. And you could, but then obviously you're going to have to retemper the blade because of the heat that's run through it. I don't know what the metal recycling at that level was like, but I can't help but feel that in a lot of circumstances, you'd almost be better off throwing that back in, getting it remelted and starting from scratch. I'm not convinced that you would actually gain by trying to re-weld when you have essentially created potential weak points. Like,
so unless it's a ceremonial badge of office kind of thing, it makes no sense.
Yeah. Like if it had magic and somehow you hitting up and bashing the crap out of it didn't take away its magical abilities, then maybe. But otherwise, it would just seem like you're asking for it to break along stress when you don't want it. So when you need it most, why would you do that?
Yeah, I'm a smithing nerd, and Robert's dead on. It's too much work. It's easier to just go get another one. Yeah, the enchantments, we can talk about stuff like that, like Anduriel or God, whatever the name of the blade was in Lord of the Rings. That's a whole different thing. We got magic smiths with elven smithing powers, and they make all kinds of crazy stuff. Like, but from a standard smithing perspective, that's not worth the time. And that's also why you see spears and axes and bill hooks and the evolutions of them as weapons, is because it takes a lot less steel and it takes a lot less skill to make stuff like that. It's a lot easier to bang out an axe, and then you have a tool and a weapon. Now, axes are not as easy to fight with as a well-made sword. You only have, your 4-6 inches of edge instead of 14 to 26 inches, or however big you want to make your Zweihander or whatever. But that's going to be another logistic: is do you give all these peasants pokies, or do you do you try and train up a better force?
Mhm.
Okay. The other part of that is you would want to consider how, like you mentioned, if they're professional army, even within professional army, there are elite units. So, the Romans had the, what was it? I'm drawing a blank. The ones that guarded the emperor.
Praetorian Guard.
Praetorian Guard. You have those kinds of units too. And do they use the same equipment that's just better made and they're better skilled at it? Do they suddenly transition to new equipment? Like the unit organization would be a factor too. Because you're going to have your light infantry skirmishers, your heavy troops, your archers, your bowmen, your horse bowmen, your lancers, like all of that factors in as well. And they all are outfitted in unique ways, which would make a difference.
Well, if you look at a lot of, if we talk strictly medieval, right, they didn't have a lot of big standing armies. You had your knights and you had maybe a few elite units, call them like the Huscarls, but a lot of them were levies. Even though they're well-equipped levies, because you're well off, you could afford a suit of mail, and you could afford a helmet and a sword, and the time to train. But most armies were just peasants being called up, freemen being called up into units, and that's who go fight the Vikings. And then this is strictly medieval times. You go back to before the fall of Rome. Rome had standing armies with legions and organizations and centurions. But once Rome fell, that kind of all went away. It turned into, you called your levies up and you see how many people showed up, and that's the force that you had to fight the Vikings with, and hopefully that was enough.
Yeah, and then like the tactics, then you start to think about, like, are they trained like the famous you see at Alexander and with Troy, where it's a lot of one-on-one combat, or are they fighting in organized unit forces, interlocking shields, that sort of thing? And that's just style. It's largely stylistically, but depending on who they face, that can be good or bad.
Well, you also have a look at things like we've talked about mounted sort of things, but there was a period, certainly in England earlier on, when they would tend to ride to places, but they did not fight mounted. They fought on foot. I'm assuming because the mounts were either not that big, or there's no way they were trained enough for it to be seen as an effective thing to them at that point in time.
Or poor terrain.
Sorry, or
poor terrain. There's this, no nice flat land that you can ride across. It's all rocky,
Yes.
It's hilly, full of gopher holes.
Yeah, the terrain, the mud and all of that, I imagine the horses wouldn't have loved. Yeah, certainly. Oh, which actually that is interesting, because that's, we were talking before, Jay, I think you talked about, issues of things of forests and that. So if we think of roads, so if your army's traveling around a road, there's quite a good military fantasy from a while ago written by Elizabeth Moon, collected as The Deeds of Paxenarian, which is about a woman who becomes a paladin, but she's part of a mercenary outfit to begin with. And one of the things that she talks about with her main character is how, depending on your position on the long line of soldiers, would depend on how much mud you got. And you have hit a certain point where that road becomes no longer passable, or essentially impassable. And so that's sort of something I think a lot of us think in terms of roads as being these always there sorts of things. And so if you are writing military fantasy, you probably really need to consider, like, if you're having your war elephants or whatever, I can only imagine the damage that they're doing to, some little country road, that would render that impassable, and then throw in the bad weather as well. That's the stuff you can play with.
And one thing to think about where Nathan was talking about weather, specifically with cavalry. So if you want to look at the Battle of Bannockburn, and I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but it was during the First War of Scottish Independence. I want to say 1313, 1314. Don't quote me on that. But that was with Robert the Bruce, and they used the boggy terrain that looked flat to lure in the British forces, and then they fell, and the horses broke their leg, and soldiers are trapped under their horses, and suddenly the slaughter began, because terrain matters, tactically as well. And for mounted forces, you do need the terrain that support it. Because if you're cav, now you're infantry, welcome to the suck.
And not to mention, speaking of horses, because I am a horse person, you need to take into account the temperament of your mount as well. Because, yeah, you've got your well-trained war horses, but if they're coming up against some magical creature that they've never seen before, they're going to freak the F out. So you need to think about, do you want to have, blinders on them so they can only see directly in front of them? Or do you want to give them certain magical supplements to keep them calm so that they don't freak out when they're coming up against a war elephant or a war bear or a giant wolf or something like that? So lots of other things.
Or a line of pikes.
You said magical supplements, and now I'm thinking about like magic steroids for the horses.
I was thinking like B12.
Magical creatine.
You guys are thinking of supplements. I'm over here like, maybe it's the stuff that Gandalf was smoking. I'm just saying.
Hey, if it works, right? If it works, why not?
Well,
Charlie,
my grandfather,
do you think
when he retired, was racing. He owned racehorses, and he told me, he's like, "Hey Nick, the secret to calm down one of these horses before the race," and he would smoke a joint and then blow the smoke in the horse's face so they'd calm down. That's what it made me think of. Like, if you want them to be like calm during a battle when there's like wizards and necromancers and shit they've never encountered before, yeah, give them a little bit of the magic herb, man. Let's make it happen.
I'm picturing like hot boxing the horses now.
That's a carriage ride I want to be on.
I'm using that.
Don't pay attention.
So, uppers for the peasants and downers for the horses. Got it.
Well, that's another thing. So we joked about the chariot, but that's another thing is how you fight your mounted, because it doesn't have to just be a knight on a horse, which is what my mind defaulted to. You had essentially war buggies, the chariots mounted or carried by 2 to 4 horses, sometimes 1, but that are essentially mobile fighting platforms for your archers, for your spearmen, because it gets you there really, really fast, and then you launch your weapon and you move, using what potentially the Mongols use, the hit and run, the hit and fade tactics.
If you look at the areas that the chariots excelled in, it was the Middle East, flat desert, lots of room to move, lots of room to roam, wide-ranging battles. So you have a chariot, so you can get to the enemy really fast, with them running away.
Something you might not particularly. Certainly didn't come to my mind until I encountered it. Was the use of chariots by natives when Caesar and that were coming across trying to take over Britain. So they weren't used to dealing with that. So yeah, chariots were used quite extensively.
There's a good movie that shows that. It's what was it? It was a BBC miniseries that we didn't get a season 2 for, those bastards, but it was called The Barbarians. We got 2 seasons, not a third. It was about the Brits and the Gauls in general fighting off the Roman legions, and they do show like the mounted versus dismounted forces and what that looks like and ways you can counter that. And realistically, like, even if it's not something they used in the battles, like historically, if you can't find an analog, if it makes sense from a logical perspective to you, if it works and it's stupid, it ain't so stupid. So like, if your answer is to pile a bunch of logs to create a fatal funnel and everyone's like, oh, that's so silly. If it works, who cares? So get as creative as you need to. is the other solution, and think outside the box. Just because it's not what they would have done doesn't mean it's wrong. It's a fantasy world. Do whatever the hell you want as long as you justify it.
Oh, I love the TV show Barbarians. It's actually German, and it was about the Teutoburg Forest.
Okay, I remember watching it. I couldn't remember it's been years, but I do know
I just like seeing the Germans killing Romans. So it's fun.
Yeah, when Various hears "Du hast in the woods," he knew he was in trouble.
Can I abuse the moment and ask
Sure.
Charlie a horse question? Because you see, like so often we see in, especially you really see it in the fantasy movies, like there they are on horses riding to get from one spot to another, and they seem to endlessly gallop. So I'm curious, like how long could someone wearing, a bit of armor or just a medium-sized person gallop on a horse before that horse can't do it or is permanently damaged?
Not long at all. I think the average max weight for a horse with, rider, armor, kit, gear, weapons, whatever, is about 200 pounds for the average horse. Now, if you're talking a draft horse, a Frisian, your Belgian, your Clydesdales, they of course can carry a lot more weight than that. But when I was researching for a cavalry story that I wrote, the average pace was a slow jog or even a trot. But as far as a full out gallop, that was only when they were charging. That was not something that you did for a very, very long extended period of time, unless you were switching out horses. So you'd gallop, to the next town, your horse would collapse. You would hop a fence, jump on another horse, and off you went and do it that way. But one horse repetitive, gallop all day long, not going to happen.
That's the other thing, as we talked about armor. If you're armoring the horses, that also weighs in too, because that will slow them down even more. Some of the movies you see them where the horses basically looks like a living tank with the armor they throw on it. I don't know how period accurate it is, but I imagine it would slow a horse down at a minimum. So,
and your earlier point about range of motion in armor, imagine how that's going to feel for a horse when they've got all those jointed pieces, and they have more limbs than we do. So, you know what I mean? Same amount of limbs, but they're using theirs differently than us. So that's going to be a consideration too.
Yeah, barding that goes back really far, but you're absolutely right that it affects endurance, and that's one of those things you do before battle. You don't do that while you're going to battle. I'm trying to think. So that's horse armor. So that's armoring your mount is barding. And that goes back, the elephants that Alexander encountered. I'm trying to think of an older example than that, but that goes back forever. That you've got some kind of mount armor.
The famous battles, at least in the English side of things, it was the 100 Years' War with the Battle of Crecy, where the English targeted the horses. Then they started armoring the horses after that, because they went, well,
is that the one where the longbowman showed it was superior? Because I want you to stab that guy way over there.
That was the first of them. The battle was Azincourt.
Yeah, that's one I was thinking.
That's the one that everyone hears about. That they got wrong in that movie, by the way. Anyways,
I want you to stab him, my lord, but he's way over there. I know. Okay. I know this is, making a believable fantasy military. There's a lot to consider, and largely this is a world building question. But I think even as readers, because all of us here, aside from creating stuff, we like to consume the product. We're bad drug dealers. We buy we sample the goods. But there's obviously a lot more minutia we could dig down into. Largely, it's when it starts talking about the military and the tactics, the world building matters first, because the military is affected by all of that. Is there anything you think on a broader scale? Like, obviously we can revisit this topic and more narrowly focus. Is there anything more broadly that we didn't address that you think is a consideration?
Just add, if you're writing modern military, make sure to get the rank structure right, so that, you don't have a corporal answering to a private as a thought. Do your research. The more believable you can make it, the better it's going to be received. And also know your target audience too. If you're writing military fantasy for veterans, you definitely want to get that stuff right.
Whereas the romance readers that have the same setting They just want the smoochies, and the rest of it's just set dressing, and they don't care as much about the details. I learned that when I side digging when I first started. I did military advising, and I found that out when the romance readers, they wanted just enough to make it plausible so they could do their story, and they didn't care about anything else because their readers didn't care. So that does matter, like who your target audience is with your genre.
In regards to the world building, everything is kind of built on each other and almost like a house of cards, where one aspect, like if you have chariots in it, but you live in the mountains, doesn't really make sense unless there's a very good reason for why do you have chariots in the mountains, right? And so all the little bits and pieces, like if you go through a village and there's 100 people, but there's the royal army is 10,000 soldiers, well, where are those soldiers coming from? Obviously not that village. Because if you look at the standard, how many men can actually, you have your population of 100 people, 100%, you can only get about between 2 and 5% of that population actually serving in the army. Now, this is everything from border guards to your city towns folk. Where's the army coming from? Right? So you have 5% of the army.
And if you want to see what happens when you do mass conscription in towns, look at what happened after World War I, where in England specifically, because they recruited their regiments locally, so this was the unit from this town or that town. When that unit got wiped, it wasn't just 1,000 men. It's 1,000 men in one localized setting, and sometimes those towns didn't recover to this day because you took away their entire, eligible workforce in one day at one battle.
I made that joke about the grenades and soup cans from Canadians, which is a real story in World War I, because that's what we did. Because you had the Germans wipe out whole towns. They had a whole high school class of hundreds of young men, and there was 4 left. So they didn't take prisoners because you just saw every single friend you had die. They're all gone. Are you going to take that German prisoner? No.
So, but that's definitely something to consider as well. Anybody else have anything they want to add?
Ooh.
It's fantasy. So as much as like we've harped on making this realistic and we've used all these wonderful historical examples, it's fantasy. Fantasy is a excuse to be creative. So don't be afraid if you can't figure something out, if you can't find the research. Use your magic, use the fact that this is not Earth or it's a different Earth than the one that we're used to. It's not going to be that big a deal, and definitely don't let it stop you from writing something fun and cool. We just talked about Pathfinder and all these really awesome movies, and they're not historically accurate in any way, shape, or form.
You lie. We know the Vikings landed and engaged the Indians. More than that, we don't know, but we do know they landed. But to harp on what you said, the rule of cool is a thing for a reason in fiction. When I read it, I don't care if you tell me lies about the way the military works, even if I know you're wrong. If you give me a plausible reason to hang my hat on so I can suspend my disbelief, I'm there for it. Like, be creative. And sometimes, if you don't have the proper training, like you'll think of solutions I would have never thought of because I revert to my training. Like in my head when I'm writing, I still sandtable it out and make it make sense to me. If you don't have that training, sometimes your answers might be unique enough that readers of the genre who might have served too are like, oh shit, why didn't we think of that? And so, there is plenty of room for creativity. And again, we keep harping back on because of the topic, like from a writer's perspective, but I'm more speaking to it, fun things to consider for the readers and the consumers of the product. Because if you've ever read it and you're like, well, how did they do this? Why did they do this as the creative? Because I've watched and kind of wondered to, peeking behind the curtain, so to speak. And these are some of the considerations from real life. And then, plot needs matter too. That's where the joke about plot armor comes from. Why did he live through that crazy? Because he's got plot armor. We need him in scene 2. So,
yeah, can I machine gun a few topics
sure.
that I think are worth taking from that world point of view, just because you got in there with the armor, and I'll go through these super fast with no depth. 1, studded leather armor is not a thing. That's a misreading of brigandine. So please, just no one ever use it. It's worth noting that armor made out of layers of linen or whatever can actually be surprisingly defensive, quite effective against cuts and things. So I think in D&D they called it padded armor, but even like a thick gambeson or something can be really handy. Language. So one of the things, a lot of terminologies that we like to use come from either like French, German, or Italian fighting traditions. So if you're creating your world, whether it's role playing, whether it's writing a novel, or you're writing a script for your movie, you got to really think about whether or not if using things from all over different locations, you can create a bit of a weird set of language in your world. And sometimes you might be better off just using plain English, so that you're not, if someone turns up in a medieval fantasy with a katana, because you love the shape of a katana. If you call a katana, like, that is breaking the reality that it's within, unless you also have some sort of Japanese culture within it. And last thing I want to throw in is maps, which you get talked to. We don't have satellites in most fantasy worlds. Often we don't have even a flying beast upon which someone is sitting there being a cartographer. So the accuracy, the availability, and the symbolism versus reality should also be taken into account. And I'll just stop there.
Speaking of armor, one of the things that they've tested this in the Mythbusters in one of their early seasons. The Mongols, they wore the capes that everyone sort of made jokes about, the homosexuality issue with it, because it just looks gaudy. But they've actually tested that, and because of the shape of the capes that they were wearing were made of silk, the layers, and then how it moved when they were moving with the wind, surprisingly deflected a lot of arrows. So there was armor even in just regular clothing, if you factor in like motion and angle. Like, there are solutions to armor that don't have to be apparent in the way we would think of armor, and that they worked. And I go
look at Renaissance fences to be an exact mirror of what you're talking about. Baggy pants, baggy sleeves, protect from cuts and make it harder to work out where to thrust. Yep.
So, Charli, did you have anything before we bring this to a close? You've been the quietest one tonight, and we got to draw you out of your shell.
I think I've covered everything I intended to. You guys just had so much great information. I was just absorbing all of it in.
Butt kissing will get you everywhere. We dig it. Flattery, right, Nick? Nick, you've been largely quiet. I know you've been listening, but is there anything you want to throw in there with your years of spicy grunt wisdom?
No, I think everybody covered everything. Definitely do your research for aspiring writers, and don't try to mix cultures if you set it as like a timepiece and those cultures have never intermingled before. Try to avoid that. Really just, make sure you know the hierarchy, the ranks and all that stuff, so you don't have a private or a corporal answering to a private or anything dumb like that. And you should be good. Formations. So if you write anything like Roman, you should probably know what the Roman formations are. You should probably know what a cohort is, and the rankings and things like that. So that's all I got to say.
All right. With that, Nathan, if we wanted to stalk you on the internet, how might we find you?
I am on Facebook. I am on X. I also have a website, nathanpetty.com, though I haven't updated it recently, and I need to. So
that is a recurring mantra from every author we interview. My website, which I haven't updated in forever, and I need to. If I got $1 every time someone said that, I could buy Earth. Charli, how might we find you on the wild interwebs?
I'm also on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and TikTok for as long as TikTok exists. Best place to reach me is my website. Oops, wrong side. There we go. charlicox.net.
And it's Charli without the E. So CHARLI. I made that mistake when I was looking for you. Because it didn't. No. So that's how I ended up finding out. I'm like, the no E is important, because there is a Charli Cox with an E, but he's an old dude.
There is.
Not
there
you.
Is. I think I think the last time I was on your podcast, I mentioned how important it is to not add the E on there. So yeah, charliecox.net, sign up for my newsletter. New one is dropping tomorrow. So yeah, join up. Whenever I get some more books out, they will be posted there. Oh, and also follow me on Amazon too. I've got a page over there as well.
So that's what most people don't realize. If you follow an author on Amazon, there's no rhyme or reason to win. But when they do publish new releases, eventually you will get an email where they say, hey, this author that you follow just released something new. And that's, even if you miss the email, life gets in the way. Those emails from Amazon let you know it's live. So, all right, Robert, Mr. R. Max Tillsley, where might we stalk you on the wild, wild interwebs?
I'm mostly as Max Tillsley on pretty much everything except for Blue Sky, where I'm just Tillsley. My website is tillsley.com. And if you're sort of interested in just a little bit about what goes under the armor and that, I did just put out a little novella called The Darkness Without, which has just mentions the changes needed when a wolf man gives his gambeson underneath to a human, so that way they can then attach their plate. So even in little novellas, you can have realism in your military fantasy.
Send that to me on Facebook Messenger, and I will include that in the show notes. So if you guys want to check that out, is that the one you wrote for my anthology, and then you wrote it too long, so you published it by itself?
The story of my life, yes.
It was supposed to be, was it 5,000 to 10,000 words? And he's like, yeah, it's a novella. I'm publishing it solo.
I know that pain.
We did one anthology where someone sent me a full novel for the steampunk. I'm like, this is really good, but this is a novel. This is not a short story. I mean, maybe it's a Brandon Sanderson short story, but this is not a short story.
This sounds like a challenge to me.
Like, it was legit 90,000 words. I'm like, sir, publish this. I mean, it's good, but it's not an anthology. Jesse, how about we track you on the wild, wild internet?
Outlawauthor.com goes to everything. I have updated it. I updated it, I want to say, last week.
That's how we know you're not an author. Clearly.
Yeah, clearly. No, I just play one on TV. So outlawauthor.com is the central spot. I have a Substack. That's where the interesting stuff happens. Instagram. I have a Facebook. That's my personal page. Feel free to add me, but you're going to get a whole lot of, guns and tattoos and stuff along with all my writing. And that's pretty much everything that actually has activity.
But do you have pictures of guns as tattoos?
Just one.
All right, perfect. All right. And this is the part, dear listener, where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right book. So if you read it and you think, you know what, this author really understood the military in his military fantasy book, and I just want everyone to know, if you read this, like, he really knows his stuff about the Roman legions. There's actually some pretty good fantasy novels where, like, the 9th Roman Legion actually disappeared in the Tolkien kind of fantasy world. If you want the readers to know that, one way to do it is to write in those book reviews, because they matter. And they also tweak the algorithm as far as how frequently Amazon recommends those books. So it really does matter, and you can make a big difference in the authors in your life. With that being said, you can find us on our Linktree, linktr.ee, Linktree/Blasters and Blades Podcast. Again, Linktree/Blasters and Blades Podcast, where we link to all the things, the BitChutes, the Rumbles, the YouTubes, the TikToks, for as long as it lasts. We are recording this in mid-January. You will be listening in February, so who knows if our TikTok still exists. We have our Twitter, our Spotify website, our Blasters and Blades Facebook group and Facebook page. We have our email, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. For professional purposes only, people. Save the shenanigans from Adam Stabby Stab over there at the Instagram, the Twitter, and the emails. You can support the show over at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that it is for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink that coffee brand coffee till it flows out of their nose, because it rhymes, people. I can still do this. And if you use the code Podcast Grunts and click the Podcast Grunt and use the link in the show notes, you get 10% off. We get a little bit of a kickback. You support an American company. It's a win-win, people. And with that, Thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my crazy co-host, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. All right, thanks for coming on, everybody. Nathan, Charlie, Robert, Jesse, it was fun. We definitely have room to come back and visit this, and hopefully next time we can try to keep it reader focused. I know these topics is really easy to focus on the How to Be a Writer podcast, but better authors than us are already doing that. So I want to try to focus it directly to the readers, because we are readers too. And with that, I'm going to hit the end button, and hopefully I can beat Nick.